Hello, Deborah Richards from Madison's Residential here, and I just thought I'd do this short video this week on the two most important or biggest questions I get asked at the moment. Number one, what is the market doing right now? And number two, what are my predictions for the market going forward? Well, many of you may know over the last few years we've had a very turbulent economic environment. Gosh, what did it used to feel like to feel normal? We've had a Brexit vote, we've had a pandemic, we've got a war going on, death of a monarch, will it ever end? And now an interesting situation, a tug of war between our central bank and the government. I'm a real great fan of this particular economist, Roger Martin-Fagg. He is a behavioural economist. And many of you may know I've got a strong interest in economics. I did it as part of my second degree and used to work in banking and financial markets for many years. So it's an area I feel quite comfortable with, and I'm fascinated by kind of the mix between hard economics and actual behavioural economics, which is what people do, which drives the economy and behaviour. And of course, over the pandemic, when we were in that first lockdown in April 2020, I did call that there would be a housing market boom, which of course there was, when many others were saying the markets would crash. So what is it looking like now? I attended a webinar with Roger yesterday. It was absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to bring you a summary of his thoughts overlaid with kind of my understanding and feelings of what's going on in the market at the moment. So let's look back at kind of why we've got this current issue with what's going on between the government and our central bank, which is the cause of all the concern and uncertainty at the moment. So, of course, inflation has been raging. So we have had a very high inflationary environment. Back in 2019, it was sitting at an average of 2%, well within government targets. And we've seen it getting up close to double digits recently. And that's because during the pandemic, so much money was pumped back into people's purses to keep them well, mean that they could afford to live because of furlough schemes, etc., and bounce back loans, and all the other things that the central banks across the global economy did to kind of mitigate those harsh effects of the pandemic from actually being in lockdown, which effectively meant that £17 trillion of new money was created. That, to put that into context, that's like the economy of China arriving on the scene, a new China coming on the block. But of course, what China does is it produces as well. So as well as being a big spender, it also produces. And with this 17 trillion of extra money that was created, there was no extra production. It was literally all in people's bank accounts and wallets and able for them to spend. And of course, when you've got so much money floating around the economy, that has to go somewhere. And so demand for goods rocketed. People had the money to spend on extension, going out, holiday, once they were allowed to. But there was nobody else extra to meet that demand. There was no extra production going on. And then you overlay that with a war in Ukraine, which meant that that problem became even more compounded because production became even worse and all that extra money was swilling around with nowhere to go. So prices started to soar because people could charge more when something is so much more in demand. So heavy inflationary environment. And of course, then what the Bank of England was trying to do was control that and also get us back to a normal functioning economy. So interest rates have been artificially low for far too long, way longer than they should be. Typically, monetary policy says that a typical central bank rate should run at about 2% above GDP. Our GDP typically would sit at about 2.5%, so add 2% to that, it should sit around 4.5%. That would be a normal functioning interest rate environment. And of course, back in 2016, the central banks were going to start raising interest rates. They were very, very low as a result of the Lehman Brothers crash back in 2008. Do you remember that? So they've been held low to stop an enormous free fall of the economy. And in 2016, they were thinking, right, let's start to get these back up again to where they should be. And we voted to leave the Eurozone. So they had to keep them low for a bit. Then they were starting to think about rising them again, and we had a pandemic. So basically, we've got used to, for far too long, a low interest rate environment. And what the central bank, the Bank of England, was doing was slightly raising them to get them back to a normal functioning market. That did not mean that Armageddon was round the corner. That will be controversial, that statement, I know, because I speak to many people who feel that it was. But certainly Martin didn't, and I didn't feel it was coming at all. I felt that the central banks were just raising rates to get them back to normal. And if you look at people's affordability, there's an interesting chart here you'll see. You can see real house price growth since back many, many years, back to the 1980s. And actually, real house price are the same rate as they were back in 2003. So what that means is when you take into account inflation, that central smooth line that you can see there, the red line there, shows the trend, the average, and the blue line shows what's actually going on all around that. But you can see that actual real house prices were roughly what they were in 2003, allowing for inflation. But if you look at people's wage growth, that was 5% above average. So in real terms, people should be able to afford to buy a property, no problem. And of course, back in 2016, it was introduced that there would be stress testing on people's mortgage payments. That meant that when banks were lending, they had to check that if rates rose by 3%, people could still afford to pay for them. So anybody who's applied for a mortgage since 2016 will have had that stress testing happening. That was abolished actually quite recently, but only a few months ago. So up until then, they've checked that people could afford it. So you put into context all those factors, house price growth probably where it was going to be with inflation, people's incomes going up, mortgage rates getting back to more normal levels, lending looking in line, GDP actually growing okay, the economy was doing all right, and I don't think we were heading for a huge recession. But then, of course, we had the mini budget. And what that has meant is whereas the Bank of England had their foot on the brake of trying to calm down the spending in the economy, the government put it firm down, foot flat to the floor on the accelerator. So now you have a big war going on, and what that meant was that was nonsensical to global markets. Global markets didn't understand that there could be such a different direction of policy between your government and your central bank. And that's why they reacted as they did. That's why sterling crashed, because it made no sense. And historically, it's not good to borrow money to bolster tax cuts. Borrowing money is good when you want to invest in the infrastructure of a company, but generally doesn't go down well when you do it just to bolster tax cuts. So of course, slight U-turn from Kwasi this week, abolishing that drop of the 45% tax band, which I think was much needed for sentiment in the energy crisis that we currently have. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from here. Many people are predicting a house price crash. I don't think that will happen, actually. I'm not sure house prices will go up in real terms against inflation because we have such a high inflation environment at the moment, but I still think they will be stable or just a couple of points up in growth. Not predicting a crash, for me that's quite easy to see why. Back in 2008, the house crash was caused by a retraction of money in the economy. Banks had no money, they had to call in debts, and you had forced sellers, and that is what often causes a price tumble. In this market, if prices start to drop, sellers will just decide not to move unless they have to. And because of that stress testing, there'll probably be very few sellers that actually do have to. So it makes me laugh a bit really when people sort of say, oh, what if prices drop? Well, if they do drop, you'll probably just won't have that opportunity to buy that house because that seller is not going to look to sell if they think their house is worth a lot less unless they have to. So you can try and time the market, but I think that's dangerous, and I'm not sure it's the wisest policy, actually. I bought my first house with my husband back in 2006. Prices were booming in 2006. Obviously, they continued to grow to 2007, then crashed. But when we sold it in 2013, we'd still more than doubled our money. So if you can afford the house, if you like the house and you can see yourself living there and you can afford the monthly repayments, and at the moment there's a lot of checking, can you afford them in a 5% interest rate environment, which is probably where interest rates are going to end up and settle. And if you can afford that and you can see yourself being there for quite a while, then my advice always is just press on with that purchase, because timing the property market is really tricky. You've got to A, call it right, and B, then hope that sellers need to take their property to market in a price crash environment and don't just hunker down and not list their property for sale, which means you can't buy it anyway unless you pay them enough to entice them out. So it's really difficult to call what the market will do. I think, as I said, rates will stable around 5%. I think growth will be quite stable. I don't think there'll be a huge recession. I think there might be a mini one. Let's wait and see on that. But the kind of overriding concern I have, which is why I can't, and as Rogers agreed yesterday, can't kind of fully call it, is the media. Our media is so intensely negative. If you believe everything you read, then you'll start to act in that way, and that will cause a spiral. So it's just be interesting to see how the media affects consumer confidence. If we all believe in our great housing market and that Armageddon isn't around the corner, I think we'll be fine. I hope you've enjoyed that. If anyone ever wants to chat any of that through with me, please do give me a call. I'll look forward to seeing you next week with my more usual roundups. Bye-bye.